The Redwood Forest in Northern California have stood for thousands of years, silent witnesses to storms, earthquakes, and the slow passage of time. But in the autumn of 1872, something stirred beneath those ancient canopies. A logging crew working near Humboldt County heard sounds that shouldn't exist. A groan so deep it vibrated through the soil, a footfall that cracked stone. When they turned, axes still in hand, they saw it, a figure 12 feet tall, draped in moss and bark, its body fused with the forest itself. Tools bounced off its skin like kindling. The men ran. When they returned days later, every tree they had marked for cutting had been torn from the earth, roots and all. No explanation was ever recorded. No body ever found. But the story survived, and so did the question, what walks among the oldest trees on Earth? The autumn of 1872 was unremarkable in most respects. The logging industry in Northern California was booming. Redwood timber was the gold of the coast, straight-grained, rot-resistant, and impossibly tall. Crews worked from dawn until dusk, felling giants that had stood since before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The work was brutal, dangerous, and profitable. Men came from across the country to swing axes in the shadow of trees, so wide you couldn't see around them. One such crew was stationed near what is now southern Humboldt County, a region dense with old-growth forest and far from any major settlement. The men were experienced. They knew the sounds of the woods, the crack of splitting wood, the whistle of wind through needles, the distant calls of elk. But on a cold October morning, they heard something else. It started as a low vibration. Some of the men thought it was an earthquake. California was no stranger to tremors, and the ground beneath the redwoods was always shifting, always settling. But this sound didn't fade. It grew, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The men stopped working. Axes lowered. Conversations died. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, each one accompanied by the snap of branches and the crunch of undergrowth. The crew turned toward the sound, toward the darker interior of the forest where sunlight barely reached. And that's when they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, massive, upright, and impossibly tall. Witnesses would later estimate its height at 12 feet, though in the confusion and terror of the moment, measurements were secondary to survival. The creature, if that's what it was, moved with a strange, lumbering grace. Its body was covered in what appeared to be moss, lichen, and strips of bark, as though the forest itself had taken form and begun to walk. Its face, if it had one, was obscured. Some men claimed they saw eyes, deep-set, glowing faintly with a greenish light. Others swore it had no face at all, just a mass of tangled vegetation where features should have been. Its arms were long, ending in what looked like gnarled roots or thick, twisted fingers. When it stepped into the clearing, the ground shook. One of the loggers, a man named Samuel Bridger, later told a journalist in Eureka that he felt his legs go weak. It wasn't just the size of it, Bridger said. It was the way it looked at us. Like we were the intruders. Like we'd woken something that had been sleeping for 1,000 years. Another logger, Thomas Mallory, was less philosophical. He raised his axe, not in challenge, but in defense. The blade caught the morning light as he swung it toward the figure. The axe struck the creature's torso with a dull thud, and then it bounced off. Mallory stumbled backward, staring at his axe. The blade was undamaged, but it had left no mark on the creature. The moss-covered body hadn't flinched, hadn't bled, hadn't reacted at all. It was as though Mallory had struck solid oak. That's when the panic set in. The men didn't discuss it. They didn't debate. They ran. Some dropped their tools. Others grabbed what they could and bolted toward the camp, toward the wagons, toward anything that represented civilization and safety. The forest swallowed their shouts. The creature, if it followed, made no attempt to chase them. It simply stood there, watching, as the crew scattered like leaves of storm. They didn't stop running until they reached the main road, nearly 3 miles from the clearing. Out of breath, hearts pounding, they collapsed in the dirt and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Some wanted to return immediately, to retrieve their tools, to prove they weren't cowards. Others refused. "You go back there, you're a dead man," one logger said. "That thing ain't natural." that thing's the forest itself, and it don't want us there. They spent the night in a nearby settlement, drinking whiskey and arguing about what they'd seen. By morning, shame and curiosity had overtaken fear. They needed their tools. They needed to know if what they'd seen was real or some kind of shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. So they returned. The clearing was unrecognizable. Every tree they had marked for cutting, more than 20 towering redwoods, had been uprooted. Not cut, uprooted. The massive trunks lay scattered across the forest floor like discarded matchsticks, their root systems exposed to the sky. The ground was torn apart. Deep furrows carved into the earth as though something unimaginably strong had simply grabbed the trees and yanked them free. Their tools were gone. Axes, saws, wedges, all of it vanished. And in the center of the clearing, pressed deep into the soil, was a single footprint. It was enormous, easily 2 feet long, with deep impressions where toes or roots had dug into the earth. No one spoke. They gathered what little remained of their camp and left. None of them ever returned to that section of forest. And none of them ever spoke publicly about what they'd seen, until years later, when age and distance made a memory feel less dangerous. But the story didn't die. It spread through the logging camps, whispered around fires, and passed from crew to crew. Some called it a hoax. Others called it a warning. And a few, those who had worked in the oldest, darkest parts of the Redwood Forest, called it inevitable, because in those woods, where trees live for 2,000 years and the ground is thick with the roots of giants, some things are older than memory. Some things were there before the first human ever set foot on the continent. And some things do not appreciate being disturbed. The men who ran from that clearing in 1872 never forgot what they saw, but they never understood it either, and perhaps that was the point. To understand what happened in 1872, you must first understand where it happened. The coastal redwoods of Northern California are not simply trees. They are monuments to time itself, living relics of an era when the climate was warmer, wetter, and more conducive to giants. Some of the trees standing today were saplings when the Roman Empire fell. Others were already ancient when the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America. The scientific name for the coastal redwood is Sequoia sempervirens, ever-living sequoia. The name is apartment. These trees can live for more than 2,000 years, grow to heights exceeding 350 feet, and develop trunks so wide that tunnels have been carved through them. They are the tallest living organisms on Earth, and their presence shapes everything around them. The Redwood Forest is not just a collection of trees. It is an ecosystem, a biome, a world unto itself. The oldest redwood groves might provoke further encounters. His warning went unheeded. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, logging in the redwoods intensified, and so did the reports. In 1883, a crew near Trinidad reported seeing a massive man-like shape moving through the trees at dusk. In 1891, loggers near Orick found their entire camp destroyed, tents torn apart, wagons overturned, tools scattered across a half-mile radius. No human tracks were found, but deep impressions in the soil suggested something very large and very heavy had passed through. In 1903, a photographer named Arthur Whitley claimed to have captured an image of the creature while documenting logging operations for a San Francisco magazine. The photograph, which still exists in archive collections, shows a blurred figure in the background of a forest scene. It is tall, taller than the men in the foreground, and appears to be covered in dark, textured material. Skeptics argue the trick of light and shadow, or perhaps a logger standing on a stump. Believers see something else entirely. As the 20th century progressed, the logging industry faced increasing pressure from conservation groups. John Muir, the famous naturalist, campaigned tirelessly to protect the redwoods, calling them the noblest of God's trees. In 1918, the Save the Redwoods League was founded, and slowly, painfully, sections of the forest were preserved. And as the logging slowed, the sighting stopped. By the 1930s, reports of the forest giant had all but disappeared. A few older loggers would tell the story over drinks, but it was always framed as something from the past, a relic of a wilder time. Younger generations dismissed it as folklore, a campfire tale meant to scare newcomers. But the story didn't vanish entirely. It went underground, kept alive by indigenous communities, by amateur cryptozoologists, and by a small number of researchers who refused to let it fade. In the 1970s, during the height of the Bigfoot craze, some investigators tried to connect the 1872 sightings to the broader Sasquatch phenomenon, but the descriptions didn't quite match. Bigfoot was described as ape-like, covered in fur, and largely passive. The forest giant was something else, something tied specifically to the redwoods, something that seemed to be made of the forest itself. In recent decades, new interest has emerged. Environmental activists have referenced the legend as a symbolic representation of nature's resistance to exploitation. Some indigenous groups have begun sharing the story more openly, using it as a teaching tool about the importance of respecting sacred lands. And a handful of researchers continue to search for evidence, combing through old journals, interviewing descendants of the original witnesses, and exploring the deepest parts of the redwood forests. Physical evidence remains elusive. No bones, no DNA, no irrefutable proof. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The redwoods are vast, dark, and largely unexplored. There are sections of old-growth forest that have never been logged, never been mapped, never been walked by human feet. If something wanted to remain hidden there, it could, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the forest giant, whether real, symbolic, or somewhere in between, was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was only meant to be remembered, a reminder that some places are not ours to take, some things are not ours to understand, and some forces are older and stronger than we can imagine. The evidence is fragmentary. The testimonies are old. The photographs are blurry, but the story endures. And in the end, maybe that's the most powerful evidence of all. Not everyone believes. For every witness who swears they saw the forest giant, there's a skeptic ready to offer a rational explanation. And in fairness, rational explanations do exist. The question is whether they adequately account for what was reported, or whether they're simply more comfortable than the alternative. The most common skeptical argument is misidentification. Northern California is home to black bears, which can stand on their hind legs and reach impressive heights. In poor lighting through fog or dense foliage, a bear could appear larger and more humanoid than it actually is. Add in the stress and exhaustion of dangerous labor, and it's easy to imagine how perceptions could be distorted. But this explanation struggles with the details. Bears, even large ones, rarely exceed 7 feet in height when standing upright. The 1872 witnesses estimated the creature at 12 feet. Bears are also covered in fur, not moss and bark. And while bears are strong, they cannot uproot mature redwoods, trees that weigh tens of thousands of pounds, and have root systems extending 50 feet or more. Another theory involves ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, and when ingested, it can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and a condition known historically as St. Anthony's fire. Some researchers have suggested that contaminated food supplies in remote logging camps could have led to mass hallucinations. It's a plausible theory, but it has significant weaknesses. Ergot poisoning typically produces vivid, chaotic hallucinations, dancing lights, distorted faces, feelings of insects crawling on the skin. The loggers' descriptions were consistent and specific. A tall figure, covered in vegetation, moving with deliberate purpose. That level of consistency across multiple witnesses doesn't align with the typical symptoms of ergot-induced psychosis. And ergot poisoning doesn't explain the physical evidence, the uprooted trees, the massive footprints, the destroyed camps. A third explanation is fraud. Perhaps the loggers fabricated the story to gain attention, to scare off competing crews, or simply to entertain themselves during long, monotonous months in the wilderness. This theory is appealing in its simplicity, but it falters under scrutiny. The men involved gain nothing from the story. If anything, they risked ridicule. And the physical evidence, particularly the uprooted trees, would have required extraordinary effort to fake, with no clear motive or benefit. Some skeptics point to the influence of indigenous legends. The Yurok and other tribes had long spoken of forest guardians and tree spirits. Perhaps the loggers, hearing these stories secondhand, projected them onto ambiguous experiences, mistaking natural phenomena for supernatural beings. This cultural contamination theory has merit, but it assumes the loggers were familiar with indigenous beliefs, which many were not. The camps were often isolated, and communication with local tribes was limited. The stories, when they did circulate, were usually dismissed by the settlers as Indian superstition. There's also the hoax theory, but of a different kind. Some historians have suggested that rival logging companies might have staged encounters to drive competitors out of valuable territories. A man in a costume, some clever stagecraft, and a few planted stories could create enough fear to clear a region. But this theory requires a level of coordination and commitment that seems unlikely. The 1872 encounter involved heavy physical evidence. Uprooted trees, deep footprints. That would have been nearly impossible to fake with 19th century technology. Then there are the psychological explanations. Pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns in random stimuli, could explain why a cluster of moss-covered trees or a standing dead snag might be perceived as a humanoid figure. Combine that, canopy is so dense that sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. Ferns, mosses, and fungi thrive in the perpetual twilight. The air is thick with moisture, drawn from the coastal fog that rolls in from the Pacific Ocean every evening. The ground is soft, layered with centuries of fallen needles, decaying bark, and root systems so vast they interconnect like a subterranean web. Native tribes who lived in these forests for thousands of years treated the redwoods with reverence. The Yurok, Toloa, and Wiyot peoples believed the trees were sacred, inhabited by spirits or beings that predated humanity. Stories were passed down through generations. Stories of forest guardians, of giants who protected the groves, of creatures made from bark and root that would emerge if the trees were threatened. These were not considered myths. They were warnings. When European settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, they saw the redwoods differently. They saw lumber. They saw profit. They saw an endless supply of timber that could build cities, fuel industries, and make fortunes. The logging began in earnest in the 1850s, and by 1872, vast swaths of the redwood forest had been clear-cut. Entire groves that had stood for millennia were reduced to stumps in a matter of years. The environmental impact was catastrophic. Streams dried up, soil eroded, species that lived nowhere else on Earth disappeared. But there were other consequences as well, consequences that couldn't be measured in board feet or profit margins. Loggers began reporting strange occurrences in the deeper, older sections of the forest. Tools would go missing, only to reappear days later in places they couldn't have been. Marked trees would fall in the wrong direction, crushing equipment and injuring men. Camps would be found ransacked, with no signs of animal activity or human intrusion. And then there were the sounds. Deep groans that echoed through the forest at night. Footsteps that followed crews, but never revealed their source. Whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Some men dismissed it as superstition or the effects of isolation. Others weren't so sure. The indigenous tribes, when asked, said little. But the message was clear. The forest was angry, and something in it was waking up. By the time the crew encountered the figure in 1872, dozens of similar reports had already circulated through the logging camps. Most were dismissed as tall tales or exaggerations, but the sheer volume of accounts and the consistency of the descriptions suggested something more. Witnesses across different camps, separated by miles and months, described the same thing. A towering figure covered in moss and bark, moving through the forest with unnatural grace, always appearing near sites of heavy logging. Some called it a forest giant. Others called it a wood spirit or a tree walker. A few simply called it the guardian. The creature, if it was a creature, seemed to appear only when the oldest trees were being cut. It never attacked directly, but its presence was enough to drive men away. And in its wake, destruction followed. Not the destruction of logging, but something else, something deliberate. Trees uprooted, camps dismantled, tools destroyed. It was as though the forest itself was fighting back. Scientists and skeptics have offered explanations over the years. Mass hallucination brought on by ergot poisoning from contaminated food. Misidentification of bears or elk seen through the fog. Hoaxes perpetrated by rival logging companies to scare off competition. But none of these explanations account for physical evidence. The uprooted trees, the massive footprints, the sheer scale of the destruction. And none of them explain why the sighting stopped after the establishment of the first redwood preservation efforts in the early 1900s. Once logging slowed and protected groves were established, the reports dwindled. The forest giant, it seemed, had returned to wherever it came from. Or perhaps it simply went back to sleep. But the memory remained. And the question lingered. What was it? A creature of flesh and blood? A manifestation of the forest's collective consciousness? A guardian spirit given form by the anger and grief of a dying ecosystem? The indigenous tribes had an answer. The loggers didn't want to hear it, and the scientists refused to consider it. But the forest remembers. The redwoods stand as they always have, silent and patient. And somewhere in the deepest, oldest groves, where sunlight never reaches, and the air smells of earth and time, something waits. Whether it will wake again depends entirely on us. In the years following the 1872 encounter, attempts were made to investigate what had happened in that Humboldt County clearing. Local newspapers ran brief accounts, often buried on back pages alongside advertisements for patent medicines and railroad schedules. The stories were treated as curiosities, frontier folklore, exaggerated by rough men with rougher imaginations. But a few journalists, historians, and amateur naturalists took the report seriously. One such investigator was a man named Dr. Elias Moreland, a naturalist and physician based in San Francisco. Moreland had a deep interest in the indigenous cultures of Northern California and had spent years documenting their oral histories. When he heard about the forest giant, he immediately traveled north to interview the loggers and visit the site. What he found surprised him. The men were not prone to fantasy. They were practical, hard-working laborers who had no reason to fabricate such a story. Their accounts were consistent, even when interviewed separately. They described the same height, the same moss-covered appearance, the same eerie stillness of the creature. More importantly, they had no financial or social incentive to lie. If anything, the story made them look foolish, men who had fled from something they couldn't explain. Moreland also spoke with members of the Yurok tribe, who lived in the region. They were initially reluctant to discuss the matter with an outsider, but eventually, an elder named Kalok agreed to speak with him. Kalok told Moreland that the creature the loggers described was known to his people as would get, a forest guardian that had existed since the time before memory. "The trees are not silent," Kalok said, according to Moreland's notes. "They speak to those who listen, and when they are hurt, they call for help. Would-get answers that call." Kalok explained that Would-get was not a single entity, but a manifestation of the forest's will. It could take many forms, sometimes appearing as a giant, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as nothing more than a feeling of unease that drove intruders away. It did not kill, Kalok said, but it did protect, and it had little patience for those who sought to destroy the old groves. Moreland was skeptical, but he documented everything. He also visited the clearing where the encounter had taken place. By then, several months had passed, and nature had begun to reclaim the site, but evidence of the uprooted trees remained. He measured the root systems, photographed the disturbed soil, and collected samples of bark and moss from the surrounding area. His conclusion, published in a small regional journal in 1874, was cautious but intriguing. He acknowledged that he could not explain what the men had seen, but he noted that the physical evidence suggested an event of extraordinary force, inconsistent with known natural phenomena or human activity. He also warned that continued logging in, with confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting pre-existing beliefs, and you have a recipe for legend building. But again, this doesn't account for the witness's insistence that the figure moved, that it stepped into the clearing. That tool struck it and bounced off. Perhaps the most interesting skeptical argument is the naturalistic one, that the creature was real but entirely explainable. Some researchers have proposed that the loggers encountered an unknown species of primate, a North American ape that has so far evaded scientific detection. This would place the forest giant in the same category as Bigfoot or the Sasquatch, cryptids that may exist but have yet to be proven. The problem with this theory is specificity. The forest giant was not described as ape-like. It was described as plant-like, covered in moss, bark, and lichen. Witnesses compared it to the trees themselves, not to an animal. If it was a primate, It was unlike any primate ever documented. And then there's the timing. Sightings of forest giant were almost exclusively tied to logging operations in old-growth redwood forests. They peaked during periods of intense deforestation and declined as conservation efforts took hold. If the creature were simply an unknown animal, there's no reason its appearances would correlate so closely with human activity. Unless, of course, it was responding to that activity, protecting its territory, defending its home. Which brings us back to the oldest explanation of all, the one offered by the indigenous peoples who lived in the redwoods long before the loggers arrived. The creature was not an animal. It was not a hallucination. It was not a hoax. It was something else, a guardian, a spirit, a manifestation of the forest will, a force that could take physical form when the trees were threatened. Skeptics dismiss this as superstition. But what if it's not? What if the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is less rigid than we assume? What if consciousness, awareness, intentionality exists in forms we don't yet understand? Modern science is beginning to acknowledge that trees communicate. They send chemical signals through the air to warn of insect attacks. They share nutrients through underground fungal networks. Some researchers argue that forests function as superorganisms, with individual trees acting as cells in a larger, connected whole. If that's true, is it so far-fetched to imagine that a forest, particularly one as ancient and vast as the redwoods, could develop something resembling a collective will? And if threatened, could that will manifest in ways that transcend our current understanding of biology? The skeptics are right to demand evidence. Science requires proof, repeatability, and falsifiability. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And sometimes, the most rational response to a mystery is not to dismiss it, but to admit we don't have all the answers. The forest giant may be a myth, or it may be a memory, but either way, it serves a purpose. It reminds us that we are not the only force in the world, that there are places older than us, wiser than us, and more powerful than us, and that some things, whether they walk on two legs or grow from the soil, will not be conquered. If the 1872 encounter was a beginning, then the events of the early 1900s marked the turning point, the moment when the legend of the forest giant shifted from isolated incident to cultural reckoning. By the turn of the century, the redwood logging industry had reached industrial scale. What had once been done with axes and hand saws was now accomplished with steam-powered equipment, railroads, and massive crews that could clear entire groves in weeks. The pace of destruction was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of acres of old-growth forest fell to the saw. Trees that had stood for 2,000 years were reduced to lumber in a matter of hours. The economic boom was undeniable, but so was the ecological collapse. Rivers choked with silt. Landslides tore through hillsides. Species that had existed nowhere else on Earth disappeared. And the stories came back. Between 1900 and 1920, reports of strange encounters in the redwoods surged. Some were eerily similar to the 1872 incident. Others were different, more violent, more aggressive, as though whatever inhabited the forest had grown tired of warnings and was now fighting back. In 1907, a logging camp near Crescent City was found abandoned. The crew had vanished overnight, leaving behind their tools, their supplies, and a scene of chaos. Tents were shredded. Wagons were overturned. A massive tree had been dragged into the center of the camp and placed upright, as though it had been replanted. No bodies were found. No explanations were offered. The company that owned the operation wrote it off as a labor dispute and never returned to the site. In 1912, a foreman named Henry Caldwell reported that his crew refused to work in a section of forest near Prairie Creek. They claimed they were being watched. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in impossible places, wedged high in tree branches, buried in the ground, or floating in nearby streams. At night, they heard footsteps circling the camp. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that never came close enough to be seen but never stopped either. Caldwell dismissed it as superstition until morning he found every single axe blade shattered. Not bent, not dulled, shattered, as though they had struck something harder than steel. He ordered the crew to leave that day. They did, and they never went back. Then there was the incident at Redwood Creek in 1918. A photographer named Margaret Kellerman was documenting the logging operations for a conservation group. She wanted to show the world what was being lost. One evening, as she set up her camera near a stand of ancient trees, she saw something moving in the shadows. She described it in her journal as a figure of immense height, draped in moss and shadow, standing among the trees as though it had always been there. She tried to photograph it, but her camera jammed. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. That night, the trees she had been photographing, trees that were slated to be cut the following week, were found uprooted. Not cut, uprooted. The logging company abandoned the site, citing unstable ground. Kellerman's journal entry, later published in a collection of conservationist writings, included a haunting line. "I do not know what I saw, but I know this. The forest is not defenseless. It has a voice, and it has teeth." These stories, and dozens more like them, began to circulate beyond the logging camps. Newspapers picked them up. Conservationists used them as ammunition in their campaigns to protect the redwoods. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. The forest giant was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming a symbol, a representation of nature's resistance to human exploitation. John Muir, in a letter to a fellow conservationist in 1916, wrote, "I have heard the tales of the forest guardian from men who do not believe in ghosts. They believe in what they saw, and whether it was a creature of flesh or a spirit of the trees, it does not matter. What matters is that the forest speaks, and we must listen." The turning point came in 1920, with the establishment of California's first redwood state parks. For the first time, significant portions of the old-growth forest were legally protected. Logging in those areas ceased. The destruction slowed, and almost immediately, the sighting stopped. It was as though the forest had been heard, as though the guardian, having succeeded in its purpose, had returned to wherever it came from. Or perhaps it had simply gone dormant again, waiting to see if humanity would keep its promise. The correlation was not lost on those who had been paying attention. The indigenous communities, who had never doubted the existence of Wiget, saw it as validation. The forest had protected itself. The guardian had done its job. And now, with the grove secure, it could rest. But not everyone believed the fight was over. Some argued that the forest giant was still there, still watching, still waiting, that it would return if the protection failed, that it was not a creature to be defeated or dismissed, but a force to be respected. In the decade that followed, the legend became part of the cultural fabric of Northern California. It appeared in local histories, in tourist brochures, in the oral traditions of families who had lived in the region for generations. Children were told the story as a cautionary tale: respect the forest or face the guardian. And the forest itself? It endured. The protected groves grew stronger. New trees sprouted in the clearings. The scars of logging began to heal, though they would never fully disappear. The redwoods, ever living, stood as they always had, patient, silent, and impossible to forget. But deep in the oldest groves, where the canopy blocks out the sky, and the air smells of ancient earth, something lingers. Not a presence, exactly, more like a memory. A feeling that you are not alone, that the trees are watching, that if you listen closely enough, you can hear them breathe. And if you're foolish enough to raise an axe, you might just hear them respond. ## Part 6. Interpretation. What the giant really means. The forest giant of 1872 is many things to many people. To cryptozoologists, it's an undiscovered species. To indigenous communities, it's a guardian spirit. To environmentalists, it's a symbol of resistance. To skeptics, it's a myth. But perhaps the most interesting question is not what it was, but what it means. Legends do not survive for over a century without reason. They endure because they serve a purpose, cultural, psychological, or spiritual. The story of the forest giant endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience: the tension between exploitation and preservation, between progress and respect, between dominance and coexistence. In the late 19th century, America was in the throes of manifest destiny, a belief that westward expansion and resource extraction were not only justified but divinely ordained. The land was there to be conquered, its resources harvested, its wilderness tamed. The redwood forests, ancient and vast, were seen as obstacles to progress. They were cut down with little thought to the consequences. But the forest giant challenged that narrative. It suggested that the land was not passive, not defenseless, not willing to be taken without resistance. It suggested that there were forces in the world older and more powerful than human ambition, and it forced those who encountered it to reckon with a troubling possibility, that they were not the masters of nature, but intruders in a realm that did not belong to them. This is why the story resonated so strongly with indigenous peoples. For them, the giant was not a monster or a mystery. It was confirmation of what they had always known, that the land is alive, that it has agency, and that it will defend itself when threatened. The Yurok concept it would get was not about a single creature, but about the interconnectedness of all living things. The idea that the forest, the trees, the soil, the water, and the air all form a collective consciousness that responds to harm. Modern science, interestingly, is beginning to catch up with this worldview. Research into plant communication, mycelial networks, and forest ecology has revealed that trees are far more connected and aware than previously thought. They send chemical signals to warn of danger. They share nutrients with struggling neighbors. They even recognize their own offspring and provide them with additional resources. The forest, it turns out, is less like a collection of individual organisms and more like a single, vast superorganism. If that's true, if forests can sense, respond, and adapt, then is it so far-fetched to imagine that they might also defend themselves? Not through conscious thought, perhaps, but through emergent behavior arising from the collective interactions of millions of living entities. The forest giant, in this interpretation, would not be a creature but a phenomenon, a physical manifestation of the forest's immune response to a perceived threat. This is speculative, of course, but it's no more speculative than dismissing the entire phenomenon as mass hallucination or fraud. And it offers a framework for understanding why the sightings were so closely tied to logging activity, why they seized when protection was established, and why the descriptions were so consistent across time and geography. There's also a psychological dimension to consider. The human mind is wired to anthropomorphize, to project human characteristics onto non-human entities. When faced with the overwhelming power and mystery of the natural world, it's natural to imagine that power taking human or humanoid form. The forest giant, in this sense, is a projection, an externalization of humanity's guilt, fear, and awe in the face of ecological destruction. This doesn't make the story any less real. Psychological realities are still realities. The fact that people saw something, whether it was a physical creature, a trick of perception, or a manifestation of collective consciousness, matters. It shaped behavior. It influenced policy. It changed how people related to the forest. And in the end, it may have saved the redwoods. Because that's the ultimate significance of the forest giant. It worked. Whether it was real or imagined, it accomplished its purpose. It scared people. It made them hesitate. It forced them to reconsider their actions. And in doing so, it bought time. Time for conservation movement to gain traction. Time for laws to be passed. Time for the redwoods to be recognized as worth saving. In this sense, the forest giant is one of the most successful legends in American history. It didn't just entertain or frighten. It protected. It preserved. It ensured that the oldest trees on Earth would not vanish into lumber and profit. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not whether the giant existed, but why it mattered. Not what it was, but what it did. Because in the end, legends are judged not by their truth, but by their impact. The redwoods still stand. The groves are protected. And the story of the giant remains, a reminder that some things cannot be taken, some places cannot be conquered, and some forces cannot be ignored. Whether you believe in a guardian or not, you must believe in what it represents. The idea that the natural world has value beyond utility, that ancient things deserve respect, and that when we harm the earth, something, whether physical, spiritual, or psychological, will push back. The forest giant is not a relic of the past. It's a warning for the future, a voice from the trees, speaking across centuries, asking a simple question. What will you do when the forest calls? Will you listen, or will you raise the axe? The redwood forests of Northern California are quieter now than they were in 1872. The chainsaws have stilled in the protected groves. The logging roads are overgrown. The ancient trees stand undisturbed, their canopies forming a cathedral of green shadow that stretches toward the sky. Tourists walk the trails, marveling at the scale and age of the giants. Children press their hands against trunks that have stood for longer than recorded history. And the forest breathes. But something lingers. Ask the park rangers, and some will tell you stories they've heard from visitors. Stories of unease in certain parts of the forest, of feeling watched, of turning to see a shape in the trees that vanishes when you look directly at it. They'll laugh as they tell these stories, framing them as campfire tales or tricks of the light. But there's always a pause before the laughter, a moment of hesitation, as though they're not entirely sure they don't believe. Ask the descendants of the loggers, and some will admit their great-grandfathers never went back into those woods, that they spoke of the forest with a mixture of reverence and fear, that they taught their children to respect the redwoods, not just as resources, but as something more, something alive, something aware, something that should never be taken for granted. Ask the indigenous peoples, and they'll tell you it get never left, that it's still there, woven into the roots and branches, watching over the groves as it always has, that it sleeps, yes, but lightly, and that it will wake again if the need arises. In recent years, climate change has brought new threats to the redwoods. Wildfires, droughts, and shifting weather patterns endanger the ecosystems that have sustained these trees for millennia. Conservation efforts continue, but they face challenges that the activists of the early 1900s never imagined. The battle to save the redwoods is not over. It may never be over. And so the question remains, if the forest is threatened again, will the guardian return? Some believe it already has. In 2019, a fire crew battling a blaze near Humboldt-Redwood State Park reported seeing a massive figure moving through the smoke, tall, dark, and impossibly calm. They assumed it was a fellow firefighter until they realized no one was stationed in that section. When they investigated later, they found deep impressions in the ash-covered ground, impressions too large to be human. The incident was never officially reported, but it was talked about, whispered about, added to the long, strange history of the Redwood Forest and the things that walk among the trees. Whether these stories are true is almost beside the point. What matters is that they continue, that each generation rediscovers a legend, reinterprets it, and passes it on. The forest giant has become part of the forest itself, a living myth rooted in the soil of history and watered by centuries of awe, fear, and respect. And perhaps that's how it should be, because the real power of the legend is not in proving it true or false. It's in what the legend does. It reminds us that we are not alone in the world, that we are not the pinnacle of creation, the masters of all we survey, the final authority on what matters and what doesn't. It reminds us that there are older, deeper, stranger things in the world than we will ever fully understand, and that we owe them respect, not because they're useful, but because they are. The redwoods do not need us. They were here long before humans arrived, and they will be here long after we're gone, if we let them. The forest giant, whether it was real or imagined, served its purpose. It protected the groves. It slowed the destruction. It gave the trees time to survive. And now, in the quiet, protected forest, the giant sleeps, or waits, or watches, or perhaps it was never a separate thing at all. Perhaps it is a forest, and the forest is it, and the line between the two was always an illusion created by minds that need clear categories and definable boundaries. Walk through the redwoods today, and you'll feel it. A presence that isn't quite a presence. A weight in the air that isn't quite physical. A sense that the trees are aware of you, assessing you, deciding whether you belong. It's not hostile. It's not welcoming either. It simply is. And if you stop, if you stand still and listen, you might hear something. Not words, exactly. Not a voice, but a rhythm, a pulse. The slow, deep breathing of something vast and ancient. Something that has seen empires rise and fall, glaciers advance and retreat, species emerge and vanish. Something that will outlast us all. The forest giant is not a monster. It's not a protector either, not in the way we understand protection. It's a reminder, a boundary, a line drawn in the soil that says, this far and no further. And for now we've listened, but the forest remembers. The trees remember. And if we forget, if we raise the axe again, if we see the ancient groves as nothing more than profit waiting to be harvested, then perhaps the giant will rise once more, not as a legend, not as a story, but as a fact, a force, a reckoning. Because some things, when pushed too far, will push back. There's a place deep in the heart of the redwoods where the light never quite reaches. The canopy is so thick, so interwoven, that even at midday the forest floor exists in a state of perpetual dusk. The air is cool, damp, heavy with the scent of decay and growth intermingled. Moss covers everything, rocks, fallen logs, the ground itself. It's a place where time moves differently, where centuries pass and nothing changes. This is where the story ends. Or perhaps where it begins again. In 1872, a crew of loggers ran from something they couldn't explain. They fled in terror, abandoning their tools, their camp, their livelihood. When they returned, they found their marked trees uprooted, their axes gone, and a single massive footprint pressed into the earth. They never went back. They never forgot. In the years that followed, the story spread. Others saw the giant. Others fled. And eventually, the forest was protected. The trees were saved. The guardian, if it ever existed, accomplished its purpose. But stories like this don't have clean endings. They don't resolve neatly, wrapped in certainty and closure. They linger. They haunt. They become part of the landscape, woven into the roots and branches, carried on the wind that whispers through the needles. Today, the redwoods stand as monuments to survival. They are proof that nature, when given a chance, endures. They are living evidence that destruction is not inevitable, that some battles can be won, that some places can be saved. But they are also a warning, because the world is warming. The forests are drying. The fires are spreading. And the protections that were so hard-won in the early 1900s are under constant threat from development, politics, and indifference. The fight to save the redwoods is not over. It may never be over. And if we lose, if the chainsaws return, if the ancient groves fall once more, then what? Will the guardian rise again? Will the forest fight back? Or has that force, whatever it was, finally exhausted itself? Has the land given up on us? The indigenous elders say no. They say Wiget is still there, still watching, still waiting. They say the forest has patience beyond human comprehension, that it will defend itself when the time comes, that we should not mistake silence for surrender. And maybe they're right. Maybe somewhere in the deepest, oldest groves, something does wait, not a creature of flesh and bone, but something else, something that exists in the space, between science and spirit, between reality and myth, between what we know and what we feel. The loggers who ran in 1872 are long dead. Their children and grandchildren are dead. But the trees they saw, the trees they tried to cut, are still standing, still breathing, still growing. And they will be standing long after we, too, are gone. That's the real terror of the forest giant. Not that it exists, but that it doesn't need to, because the redwoods themselves are the guardians. The redwoods themselves are the force, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to human timelines and human ambitions. We walk among them as temporary visitors in a realm that predates us and will outlast us. We can respect that, we can protect it, or we can ignore it and face whatever consequences follow. The choice has always been ours. But the forest will have the final word. And in the quiet of the grove, if you stand very still and listen, really listen, you might just hear it speak, not in words, not in threats, but in the creak of ancient wood, the rustle of needles, the slow, steady exhalation of a living world that has endured for 2,000 years and intends to endure for 2,000 more. The giant may sleep, but the forest never does, and it is watching,